A good vach, everybody. Shavua Tov and Happy New Year. It's great to be with you and to starting the new year 2022 with some beautiful learning. That was Keep Alive doing their version of Havdalah. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on the first day of 2022? Excuse me. Tom says Shavua Tov. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. James in Indianapolis. Bill says Shavua Tov and Happy New Year. Nancy in North Carolina. Tom is back in PA. Sam, Shavua Tov and an early Hodesh Tov. Tomorrow is Monday is Rosh Hodesh. Monday is Rosh Hodesh. But I guess it starts tomorrow night. Yehud, it's in South Carolina. Bella in Florida. Melissa in Great Neck. Linda says hi, Sharon. Pam is in Georgia. Lucy in Minnesota. Steven in New Hampshire. Guy in Ohio. Linda is in South Carolina. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. As I mentioned before, I'll mention again now. I'm traveling, God willing, tomorrow, so no class until Thursday. I'm going on a short trip for a wedding. Please God, everything goes well. I don't get caught with COVID at my destination and have trouble getting back. Please God, that would stink. I have allergies this time of year, so I have a runny nose, but I've now taken 2 COVID tests just to be sure. I am negative. But man, I'm going through an airport. I'm scared to have a runny nose. Who knows what kind of looks I'll get. So I'm sure I'll take a decongestant tomorrow and hopefully everything is fine. And then at the wedding, they're going to make everyone take another test before the wedding. I mean, what times we're living in. But I think all the more important that we show up for each other's events, observe all the stringencies that are necessary so that we're all safe. But, you know, the isolation of these times has really taken a toll, especially on children. And I think it's important to be there for each other in person when possible. All right, today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld, our dear friend Rabbi Adam Kligfeld and his wife Chavi. The dedication is in honor of Sal and Nina, pioneering teachers and promulgators of Torah. Thank you so much. What a sweet dedication. Adam, may you and Chavi and all the kids and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, even beyond what your ample imaginations could conceive. And we say, Amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Where are we holding? This is Daf Yud Tes, page 19 here in Tractate Megillah, the 11th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Purim. We are in chapter 2 today, concluding our discussion, the Gemara's on Mishnah number 1 and opening Mishnah number 2 and closing it, and Mishnah number 3. After all that extended digressions and commentary on the Megillah itself in response to Mishnah number 13 of chapter 1, now we're going to be hitting Mishnahs at a faster clip. So yesterday we were talking about, what are the requirements of the Megillah itself, the actual scroll, a book of Esther written in a scroll, that a reader reads out loud so that the people listening and the reader himself or herself fulfills their obligation to hear the Megillah read on Purim, what kind of ink, what kind of parchment, etc. And so we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2 with this right at the top of 19a. It was taught in the Mishnah, he does not fulfill his obligation unless the Megillah is written in Ashurit. And as we've discussed, Ashurit is the modern. It seems very ancient to us, but the kind of Hebrew script that we think of as Hebrew was actually not the earliest Hebrew writing. That's called Ivrit when it's referred to here in the Talmud. But Ashurit is what we're used to. And I'm pretty sure I read that is the kind of Hebrew script that they sort of returned with from the exile in Babylonia/Persia. And so it's no surprise that that's the kind of Hebrew script that the Megillah, which was later than the Ten Commandments, the Torah, and all the rest of Scripture, right, is the last book added to Scripture. But that the Megillah was originally written in that kind of Hebrew writing that we think of as Hebrew writing today. So the Megillah must be written in that Hebrew script. On ink, on parchment. And the Gemara explains the reason for this as it is written concerning the Megillah, in the Megillah, at Esther 9:27, according to their writing and according to their time. And the Mishnah concludes he does not fulfill his obligation unless the Megillah is written upon parchment and with ink. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? And the Gemara answers, it is derived by way of a verbal analogy between one instance of the word writing and another instance of the word writing. It is written here in the book of Esther. Then Esther, the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote all the acts of power, right? Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and not her father Mordecai, but Esther and Mordecai wrote these words. Wrote all the, and this is important as we're going to get into the second Mishnah, wrote all the acts of power to confirm this second letter of Purim, letter that was sent from the palace out to all the precincts, the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire at that time. And it is written there in the book of Jeremiah. Then Baruch answered them, he pronounced all these words to me with his mouth, and I wrote them with ink on the parchment. And just as there, the writing must be with ink on was with ink on parchment, so too here, the Megillah must be written with ink on parchment. Mishnah number 2, here in chapter 2 of Tractate Megillah. With regard to a resident of an unwalled town who went to a walled city, and recall that we have a distinction between people who live in cities that are old enough to have had a wall, old and prominent enough to have had a wall around them way back at the time that Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. In such a city, and only Jerusalem counts as such a city today, at least in the Holy Land, in such a city, they read the Megillah on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Adar. Everywhere else, they read it on the 14th of Adar. So what happens if you live in such a city where it's normally read on the 15th, but you're traveling and you're in some other city, a normal town where they read it on the 14th? What do? Do you read the Megillah along with everybody else in the town where you're visiting? Or do you keep to your requirements because you live in a city where it's read on the 15th? That's the question we're addressing. Excuse me. I did a neti pot earlier today too, if you guys know what that is. That helps a little, but whatever. It's just this time of year I get a runny nose. All right. With regard to a resident of an unwalled town who went to a walled city where the Megillah is read on the 15th of Adar, and conversely, a resident of a walled city who went to an unwalled town where it is read on the 14th, the following distinction applies. If he is destined to return to his original place, he reads according to the law governing his own place. And if not, i.e. if he is not destined to return to his place, he reads with them, the residents of his current location. Now, you might think, destined to return, how do we define that? I mean, if he's merely visiting as opposed to he moved to this city permanently, is that the distinction? Or is it that he's going to return to his own city within a month, a week, a day? What does it mean? We will, of course, define it. Beginning from where, and now a second question, beginning from where must a person read the Megillah in order to fulfill his obligation? You might have thought you have to read the whole Megillah. Rabbi Meir says he must read all of it. Rabbi Yehuda says he need read only from there was a certain Jew. That's Esther chapter 2, verse 5. And Rabbi Yosei says from after these things. That's Esther chapter 3, verse 1. And as we'll see, there's a fourth opinion, which is even further on in the Megillah. How do you fulfill your obligation to read the Megillah or to hear it read out loud? Do you have to hear the whole thing, or is it enough to hear it from a certain place forward to the end? We have these different opinions. I'll just give away the ending of this discussion that the law is you have to read and hear the whole Megillah. A person has to read it so that everyone else can fulfill their obligation to hear the whole Megillah. Gemara. Rava said they taught the Mishna that one who is destined to return to his own place reads according to the law governing his own place only with regard to one who is destined to return to his own place on the night of the 14th of Adar. Meaning, you might be in that city, but if you're going to get back to your own city that same night, okay, then you can follow the laws of your own city. But if you're going to even just be in this town that you're visiting for the day of Purim, all of Purim, then you follow the laws of the locality where you are. But if he is not destined to return on the night of the 14th, although he does intend to return to his own place eventually, he reads with the residents of his current location. Rava said, from where do I say this? As it is written, Esther 9:19, therefore the Jews of unwalled towns who dwell in the unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month, Adar, a day of gladness and feasting. Since it is already written, the Jews of unwalled towns, why do I need that additional phrase, who dwell in the unwalled towns? It comes to teach us this, that one who is in an unwalled town, even for the day, is also called one who lives in an unwalled town for the purposes of this halacha. And the Gemara asks, we have found proof for a resident of a walled city who is temporarily located in an unwalled town. But from where do we derive the opposite case, that one from an unwalled town who is temporarily in a walled city is governed by a similar halacha, similar law? And the Gemara answers, it is based on logical reasoning. Since one who is in an unwalled town for the day is called someone from an unwalled town, so too, conversely, one who is in a walled city for a day is called someone from a walled city. And Rava said further, someone from a village where the Megillah is read on the Monday or Thursday prior to Purim. So we covered that at the beginning of our tractate, that somebody who lives in these villages in ancient times where they would have market days on Mondays and Thursdays, where they would be gathered in one place, and it was a much more favorable circumstance to hear the Megillah read with a proper crowd, and freeing them up to bring into town the food and drink that the residents of that town would need to celebrate Purim properly, so they could read the Megillah, they could advance the reading of the Megillah a few days, right? As many days as needed, so that it would land on a Monday or Thursday preceding the 14th of Adar. Okay, so what about if you're visiting one of those villages, or a person from one of those villages is visiting an unwalled town? So the Gemara asks, we have found, wait a minute. And Rava said further, someone from a village where the Megillah is read on a Monday or Thursday prior to Purim, who went to a town, an unwalled town. He reads the Megillah with the residents of the town, even if he had already read it in his own place, right? Because he lived in the villages where they allow it to be read on Mondays and Thursdays, and so he read the Megillah on that day, and now on the 14th of Adar, 1, 2, or 3 days later, he's in an unwalled town where they're reading it on the 14th. Has he already fulfilled his obligation? Does he need to hear the Megillah again? Yes, he needs to hear the Megillah again, according to Rava. And he does so in all circumstances, whether or not he will be returning to his own village. And the Gemara explains what is the reason for this ruling. This villager should actually have read at the same time as the residents of the towns, but the sages showed leniency toward the people of the villages and allowed them to advance the reading of the Megillah to the previous day of assembly, a market day, Monday or Thursday, so that they would be free to supply water and food to their brethren in the cities on the day of Purim. This, however, applies only when the villager is in his place, in the village. But when he is in a town, he is required to read like the residents of the town, and not like the villagers. Abaye raised an objection to Rava from a Baraisa. A resident of a walled city who went to an unwalled town, in all circumstances, whether or not he will be returning to his own city, reads the Megillah according to the Halacha governing his permanent place, the place he came from. And the Gemara first questions the text of the Baraisa as it is currently worded, right? That this Baraisa that's being brought as an objection, maybe there's something wrong with the Baraisa. Baraisas are contemporaneous with Mishnas, but less authoritative. And sometimes Baraisas get challenged, like this one. Can it enter your mind that the resident of a walled city always reads in accordance with the Halacha governing his own place, even if he is currently situated in an unwalled town? But doesn't the matter depend on whether or not he will be returning on the day of Purim to his hometown, as stated in our Mishna that we're studying now, and the Mishna has greater authority? Rather, is it not to be changed to, the Baraisa should be amended to read, a resident of a village who went to an unwalled town, right? A resident of a village who went to an unwalled town, no matter where he goes, he follows the law not of where he came from, but of the place where he finds himself. And the Baraisa therefore teaches that a resident of a village who is visiting in a town must read the Megillah according to the Halacha governing his own place, the village, unlike Rava's teaching. But we know that's wrong. It's got to be wrong. And the Gemara rejects this. But did you not amend the reading in the Baraisa? Since you admit that the Baraisa in any event requires revision, change it further and teach, he reads the Megillah with the residents of the town. And this wording in the Baraisa would then support the opinion of Rava, and that's where they leave it. So the Baraisa was, as first worded, was discredited. And the Mishnah teaches that three sages disagree about the question, beginning from where must a person read the Megillah. So now we're in the second question. How much of the Megillah do you need to read and hear read in order to fulfill one's obligation? And we have three, in the Mishnah, we have three opinions. Where do these opinions come from? So beginning from where must a person read the Megillah? It is taught in a Baraisa that there is a fourth opinion as well. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says one must read from on that night. Esther 6:1. Esther has 10 chapters. According to the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it's enough just to read from chapters 6 to 10, less than half of the Megillah. Rabbi Yohanan said, and all of these Tanaim, all of these sages of the Mishnah, in arriving at their respective opinions, were expounding the same verse. As it is stated, Esther 9:29, then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote about all the acts of power to confirm this second letter of Purim. In other words, they wrote what had happened to give them the power to send these letters out to the 127 provinces and tell people what to do and how to observe Purim. Where am I? And the one who said that the Megillah must be read in its entirety interprets acts of power as referring to the power of Ahasuerus, the king. And so the Megillah must be read from the beginning, where the power of Ahasuerus is first established. He was the king who ruled over the 127 provinces and was having that party at the beginning that led to the demise of Queen Vashti. And the one who gave the opinion that says it needs to be read from there was a certain Jew in chapter 2 explains that acts of power is referring to the power of Mordecai. And the one who says that it needs to be read from after these things maintains that the acts of power is referring to the power of Haman, which he had the power to try to destroy all the Jews, that power was taken away from him and he was destroyed. And the fourth opinion, the one who said that it needs to be read from on that night in chapter 6, understands that the expression is referring to the power of the miracle, meaning the power of God, which began on that night when Ahasuerus could not sleep, and therefore one must begin reading the Megillah from there. On that night, he couldn't sleep, and he asked the books of Chronicles to be brought to him. And that's when he read that Mordecai foiled a plot to kill the king, and he rewarded Mordecai and elevated him and made Haman do the elevating. And then the rest of the events went from there. Rav Huna said the four sages derived their respective opinions from a different verse. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, and of that which they saw concerning this matter, and that which had befallen them, the Jews ordained that they would keep these 2 days, right? The letters that went out about these acts of power were also referring to, that the Jews could destroy their enemies on what would have been the day when they were going to be destroyed. But in this verse, it's more about how we're going to observe Purim in generations to come. Esther 9, 26 and 27. So Rav Huna continued, the one who said that the Megillah must be read in its entirety explains the verse as follows. They saw refers to what Ahasuerus saw, in that he used the vessels of the temple for that party at the beginning. He thought, okay, the exile of the Jews has lasted more than 70 years. They're never going to get their second temple. And now I can use the temple vessels to party with, right? He wasn't destroyed because of that. So, I'm not sure about that. Concerning this matter was because he had calculated 70 years from the Babylonian exile, and the Jews were still not redeemed. And he consequently thought that they would never enjoy deliverance. And that which had befallen them is referring to the fact that he had killed Vashti, his queen. And since the Megillah was written and continues to be read in order to inform future generations of all these events and what happened to the people who were involved, and these are detailed at the beginning of the Megillah, it must be read in its entirety. And that's the dispositive reason, because the law is that we must read the whole Megillah. And the one who said that the Megillah needs to be read from there was a certain Jew interprets this verse as follows. That which Mordecai saw, in that he acted so zealously concerning Haman, concerning this matter was because Haman made himself an object of idol worship. Haman wanted everyone to bow to him as if he was a god, and he wore an idol of himself on a chain around his neck for that purpose. And that which had befallen them is referring to the fact that a miracle took place. Therefore, one must read the Megillah, at least from there was a certain man. And the one who said that it needs to be read from after these things interprets the verse in this way. That which Haman saw, in that he became incensed with all the Jews. Concerning this matter was because Mordecai did not bow down nor prostrate himself before Haman. And that which had befallen them is referring to the fact that he and his sons were hanged on the gallows. Accordingly, the Megillah must be read from the first mention of Haman. And the fourth opinion, the one who said that the Megillah must be read from on that night, in chapter 6, offers the following explanation. That which Ahasuerus saw, in that he commanded to be brought the book of Chronicles before him concerning this matter, was because Esther had invited Haman along with him to the banquet that she made. And that which had befallen them is referring to the fact that a miracle took place. And therefore one must read the Megillah from on that night the king could not sleep, and he commanded to have brought the book of Chronicles. And Rabbi Chalbo said that Rav Chama Bar Guria said that Rav said, the Halacha, the law, is in accordance with the statement of the one who says that the Megillah must be read in its entirety. And moreover, even according to the one who said that it need be read only from there was a certain Jew and onward, nevertheless, the Megillah itself must be written in its entirety. So even according to that opinion, you might get away with reading only from chapter 2 forward, but the Megillah in front of you has to be a complete Megillah. But we don't follow that opinion. We follow that you must read the whole Megillah. And Rabbi Chalbo said further that Rav Chama Bar Guria said that Rav said the Megillah is referred to as a book, as a sefer. And it is also referred to as a letter. It is both referred to as a book and as a letter. It is called a book, indicating a comparison to the book of the Torah, i.e., to a Sefer Torah, Torah scroll, to teach us that if one sewed its parchment sheets together with flax threads the Megillah is unfit, just as a Torah scroll sewn in this manner is unfit. Rather, what are the pages, the large pages of parchment that are sewed together to make a continuous Torah scroll? What is the thread that is used to sew them together? It's sinew, right? It's animal tissue. Just like the parchment itself is made from animal skin, the threads that hold it together are also made from animal tissue. And it is called a letter to teach us that if one stitched the Megillah sheets together with only 3 threads of sinew in the manner of a letter, the Megillah is fit for use, as it does not have to be completely stitched like a Torah scroll. And Rav Nachman said this is true, provided that the stitches are made in 3 parts. And we have a note about this. In most cases, one piece of hide is not enough to write an entire Megillah, and therefore several sheets of parchment must be attached together. And the sages taught that, like the parchment itself, even the stitches must be from a material that comes from an animal, i.e. thin tendons that are made into strings and used to stitch. Since not all the stringencies of a Torah scroll apply to a Megillah, it is not required that one follow the law of stitching a Torah scroll, and it is enough that it be sewn with only 3 stitches. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, if one reads from a Megillah that was written together with the rest of the writings, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Meaning, if you had, you have a Sefer Torah scroll, and then in old times, like all books of scripture were also written scrolls, wound around dowels like a Torah, either a single dowel or 2 dowels like a Torah. So if you were reading from a Megillah that was just part of a scroll that contained other books of writings, right, from the Bible, as opposed to the books of the prophets or the Torah itself, the writings are just that part of the Bible. But if your Megillah is just part of the writings, so you haven't fulfilled your obligation to read and listen to the Megillah on Purim. You need a special Megillah, a special scroll that is only made to be a book of Esther, to be a Megillah for Purim. If one reads from a Megillah that was written together with the rest of the writings, Ketuvim, he has not fulfilled his obligation, as it must be evident that one is reading specifically from the Megillah rather than simply reading ordinary passages from the Bible. And Rav has said, we said this only in a case where the parchment of the Megillah is not a little shorter or longer than the parchment of the other biblical books on the scroll and are consequently not plainly discernible among them. But if the pages are a little shorter or longer than the other sheets of parchment of the other biblical books, we have no problem with it, and one may read from such a scroll. It was related that Levi bar Shmuel was once reading before Rav Yehuda from a Megillah that was written together with the rest of the writings. Now we're on the B side of page 19. And Rav Yehuda said to him, the sages have said, if one reads from a Megillah that was written together with the rest of the writings, he has not fulfilled his obligation. And Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, if one reads from a Megillah that was written together with the rest of the writings, he has not fulfilled his obligation. But they hit this halacha on its head, meaning they adjusted it and removed much of its force. They hit this halacha on its head, i.e. immediately after reporting this ruling, they added a qualification that removed much of its force. They taught this halacha only with respect to reading the Megillah for a congregation. An individual who reads the Megillah in private fulfills his obligation even if the Megillah was written together with the rest of the writings. Only when it is read in public must it be from a Megillah that is a separate scroll. So if you find yourself alone and you're going to read the Megillah out loud for yourself, you can do that from a Bible. You don't need a separate Megillah. Rabbi Chia bar Abba also said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the halacha, the law of leaving a space without stitches. Now that we have a ruling, a teaching reported by Rabbi Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to have a few more teachings with that same provenance that may or may not relate to the laws of Purim. This first one does not. Rabbi Chia bar Abba also said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the halacha of leaving a space without stitches, i.e. that the parchment sheets of a Torah scroll must not be sewn all the way to the edge, but rather a small margin must be left at the top and at the bottom, is a halacha, is a law transmitted to Moses from Mount Sinai, i.e., it was not written in the Torah, but it was received in the framework of the original oral law given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So now that we're talking about how the pages of parchment in a Megillah are stitched together, and we mentioned in passing about a Torah scroll, now we're going to learn something more about a Torah scroll. Its sheets of parchment are stitched together with sinew. They're stitched together, in a very strong manner that's going to last, but they're not stitched all the way to the edges of the page. Why? So you don't have to go right to the edge, but they immediately hit this halacha on its head, explaining that this halacha is not due to the special sanctity of a Torah scroll. Rather, they said it is only so that it does not rip. If the scroll is wound too forcefully, the sheets of parchment will begin to spread apart, since they are not sewn together at their extremities, and the one who is winding will cease to wind it so forcefully. If the stitching went all the way to the end, there would be no such warning, and the stitches would cause the parchment to rip. It was a practical matter, but it was told to Moses at Mount Sinai. And Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, had there been left open a crack, so much as the size of a small sewing needle, in the cave in which Moses and in the cave in which Elijah stood when God's glory was revealed to them, as it is written, right? We have the incident where God revealed God's glory to Moses, right? When Moses said, let me see your glory. And God said, you cannot see my face and live, but I will pass by you and you shall see me from behind, as it were. And Elijah was also shown something. Where are those passages? Exodus 33:22. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock. And about Elijah, and he came there to a cave, and behold, the Lord passed by. But when they were in that cave, they were utterly sealed off. For had there been even a crack the size of a needle, they would not have been able to endure due to the intense light that would have entered that crack. As it is stated, for no man shall see me and live. Right? So it's interesting. We have that image of God puts Moses in the cleft, and then God's presence passes by, but God puts his hand over Moses. So he's in total darkness, and yet he sees something or feels or experiences the Lord passing by. But if he had seen it with his eyes, he would have died. And the same with Elijah. Even a tiny crack would have allowed in some of that infinite light of Hashem, of God, and that would have been too much, overwhelming. And Rabbi Chiya bar Abba further said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the fourth teaching with this provenance, what is the meaning of that which is written? And the Lord delivered to me 2 tablets of stone, written with the finger of God, and on them was written according to all the words which the Lord spoke with you in the mountain. Deuteronomy 9:10. This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, showed Moses on the mountain all the inferences that can be derived from the words of the Torah, and all the inferences that can be derived from the words of the scribes, the early sages, and also all the new halachas, all the new laws that the scribes were destined to introduce in the future, in addition to the laws of the Torah. Right, the laws that are from the rabbis that help us, that protect us from accidentally coming to break the laws of the Torah. And what is it specifically that the scribes would introduce in addition to the laws of the Torah? The reading of the Megillah, right? And that the scribes would add as opposed to the sages, right? So all of the prophets did not introduce any new mitzvahs, any new laws, with the exception of, in the book of Esther, came a new commandment that we read the Megillah and the other observances of Purim every year. And that was added within Scripture. Hanukkah is not in Scripture. So the commandment to light the Hanukkah lights is a commandment. We understand God commanded us in the sense that He's commanded us to listen to what the sages command us to do by a majority of them. And so they instituted Hanukkah, but that didn't end up in the Bible. the inferences from the words of the Torah and the inferences from the words of the scribes. The early and later commentaries discuss this principle at length. The Darashat Haran explains that not only was the Torah given to Moses, but also all the various approaches of interpretation found in halachic midrash and agadic midrash. In other words, the principles that our sages would use to derive rabbinic laws from the Torah, that process was already revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, and that's why the sages had an authority and a method for deriving the rabbinic laws. That idea that they would have the authority and a procedure by which to do that originated at Mount Sinai. That's the birth of the oral tradition. It came from God. We didn't innovate that there would be an oral law. We didn't innovate how the sages would derive laws. All those principles went stretch all the way back to Moses receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. I'm almost done. If you got questions or comments, get them in. We're going to read Mishnah number 3 and then a quick Gemara on that, and then we'll go to comments and questions. Everyone, Mishnah number 3 of chapter 2. Everyone is fit to read the Megillah, meaning to read it out loud, and that the one who listens to that fulfills his obligation by hearing it. Everyone is fit to read the Megillah, except for a deaf person, an imbecile, and a minor. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that a minor is fit is fit to read the Megillah. Okay. Excuse me. Everyone is fit to read the Megillah except for a deaf person, an imbecile, and a minor. Now, the deaf person is distinguished here from the deaf mute that they're normally talking about, who lacks capacity to be obligated in certain laws with respect to other laws. Here, this person can read out loud, so he's not mute, but he can't hear the words. And since we're commanded to hear the words, he can't fulfill his own obligation to hear it. Questions get asked about sign language. That's a fascinating question that didn't exist back then. It exists now. I'd love to know what the laws on that are. I haven't done that research. An imbecile doesn't know what's going on. A minor, they're going to make a distinction between a minor who is old enough to start receiving training in the mitzvahs and one who's even younger than that. Often, women are included along with these categories, as in ancient times, very patriarchal system, that they could not fulfill somebody else's obligation because they are not obligated in time-bound positive mitzvahs. But as you see here, a woman can read the Megillah. According to this Mishnah, she's not on this list. Now, the Gemara asks, who is the Tana that taught the reading of a deaf person even after the fact? No, it is not still valid. So we often have this distinction between ab initio and after the fact. It would be better not to have a deaf person whose voice still is audible read the Mishnah, read the Megillah out loud. You should have somebody who's fulfilling their own obligation when reading it. But if you heard the Megillah read by a deaf person, then after the fact, you did fulfill your obligation. Whereas another opinion says, even after the fact, even before the ab initio, right, before you do it, you shouldn't do it that way. But if you did do it that way, it's still not valid, right? That's a distinction being made here. So who is the Tana that taught that the reading of a deaf person, even after the fact, no, it's still not valid? Rav Matana said, it is Rabbi Yosei. As we learned in the Mishnah elsewhere, Brachos 15a, if one recites the Shema, but does not make it audible to his own ears, he has nevertheless fulfilled his obligation, right? When you say Shema, you should hear it. But if you don't hear it, nevertheless, but you read it and you said it in, but you thought it inside distinctly every word, so you fulfilled your obligation, but that's not the right way. It's not the optimal way to do it. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei said he has not fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Yosei's statement implies that one who does not hear what he is saying does not fulfill his obligation. So presumably the laws for Shema recitation and Megillah reading are equivalent. so far. And the Gemara questions the assumption on which the previous discussion is based. From where do you know that the Mishnah, which states that a deaf person may not read the Megillah, reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, and that it means to say that even after the fact, no, one does not fulfill his obligation if the Megillah is read by a deaf person? Perhaps the Mishnah was taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and it should be understood as saying that a deaf person may not read ab initio, but after the fact, if that's how it happened, then the reading and the one who heard it, it's valid. And the Gemara rejects this proposal. This should not enter your mind, as the Mishnah teaches, the halacha of a deaf person, an imbecile, and a minor together, implying that a deaf person is similar to an imbecile or a minor. Therefore, it may be inferred that just as the readings of an imbecile and a minor are not valid even after the fact, so too, even after the fact, no, the reading of a deaf person is not valid. This discussion is going to go on. Here's the law. Anyone who is obligated to read the Megillah may read it for himself and for others. However, some say a man who hears a woman reading the Megillah does not fulfill his obligation. Some say. Most of the halachic authorities rule that one cannot fulfill his obligation by hearing the Megillah read by a deaf person in accordance with the opinion of the first Tana. Others write that, after the fact, he has fulfilled his obligation in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, let's go to questions and comments. Tom, people were so much less likely to travel back then, meaning they had less familiarity with the practices and customs of other places. Right, so where does that go to? To say that it makes sense that they follow the custom of the local place that they're in, or that they don't, right? And really, how far could they go where they would be in a situation to hear the Megillah read on the 14th, knowing they're going to be back in their own town on that same night, right? On that same night. So it's like at dusk, they're in one city, and then they set out, and they're going to get back to their own city sometime during that night, and then they should hear the Megillah read that night in their own town, right? And so unless they're returning that night, they have to do what the locals are doing. And so you're right that they probably don't know, but they need to find out. And they're going to just celebrate with some community, right? They're going to have to get to a synagogue in that community where they're visiting. Yosef, I suppose the rabbis are debating what is the context of the Megillah in order to fully understand it. Oh, you're talking about from where in the Megillah are we obligated to read it? There's other ideas that you might need less than the whole Megillah, but as we said, the law is you must read the whole Megillah. Sharon, if you read it for yourself from a book, do you still say the blessing on the reading of a Megillah? Also, if your community does not have a Megillah, is it permissible to read from a book? Well, as we saw on yesterday, that in exigent circumstances, Rabbi Meir was allowed to write a Megillah from memory. And so perhaps we could think that in exigent circumstances, you only have a book, you read from a book, better than not reading the Megillah at all. Do we say the bracha when we read it for ourselves? I think yes. I'm not a rabbi. I don't have these things at the tip of my tongue. And so that question could certainly be researched. But it seems to me that yes, but remember that the mitzvah is to hear the Megillah. So 100%, if you're going to say that blessing, you can't just be reading it and thinking it, right? You got to read it out loud so that you can fulfill your obligation. And when you're making the bracha, it's because you're fulfilling your obligation, not just reading the story of the Megillah on Purim. Fulfilling the obligation requires hearing it. So if you're alone, you're going to read it out loud. And in that situation, I would think you can say the bracha. But I'm not a rabbi. Yosef, was Moses given the Torah by God himself or through an angel? By God himself. Right, God, some manifestation of God. Remember, we're in God, right? So it's not like there's some there's God and there's me, and what God showed Moses when he was in that cave, we can't even begin to contemplate what that is. So God definitely inscribed the 10 Commandments twice, right? The second set of tablets, Moses carved the tablets, but God did the inscribing. For the rest of the Torah, Moses was up in Shemayim, right? He was up in heaven receiving all the laws of the Torah. And I guess taking dictation. He was writing it down as he heard it, but we don't know exactly what happened up there, but definitely from God. And Tom, what about a hearing person who loses his hearing? Well, that would be a person who can speak, right? I mean, much more challenging for a person who's never had hearing to also be a speaker. But the one who had hearing and then lost it, I guess, would be this person who could perfectly well read it out loud, and could make it very clear for the people listening, even though he himself could not hear it. So, for most opinions, the problem is that he himself, right? He is not obligated because he cannot fulfill that obligation. He lost his hearing. It's not his fault, but he did, and that's why listening to that person read it is not optimal. But if one heard it that way, even though it's not optimal, it seems that according to most opinions, you have fulfilled your obligation. That's what I've got for us tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, with God's help, I'm leaving tomorrow morning early to travel for a few days to attend a wedding. So we won't have class again until Thursday. And at that time, we'll do a makeup show, a highlight show of these pages. Pages 20, 21, 22, 23, and then I guess on Thursday it'll be 24, and maybe we'll even do 25 since we're running a page behind, and then we'll get caught up that day, depending on how fascinating these upcoming pages are. Maybe we'll do less than that number and not try to rush so much through the catch-up show, but at any rate, no class until Thursday. Everybody should keep reading, and then we'll be together again on Thursday, God willing. A good vach, Shavua Tov. May you be blessed with a good week and a great, great 2022. May it be a year of health, joy, sweetness, prosperity, and all good things for you and yours. And right immediately, it should be a great week. All the best.